Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another London lecture in this, our centenary series of lectures brought to you by the Royal Institute of Philosophy. It's a great pleasure to have with us this evening John Haldane. John is currently the J. Newton Razor Distinguished University Professor of Philosophy at Baylor University. He was formerly, and for many years, University Professor at St. Andrews. He was Papal Advisor to the Vatican. He's delivered a series of Gifford lectures. In fact, if I stood here and recited his list of academic distinctions, we'd be here for a very, very long time. We'd probably not hear very much of his talk. An interesting tidbit, or at least detail, that I discovered on researching his bio is that his first degree was in fine art, and he continues to write about art alongside his many books on philosophical subjects, which include An Intelligent Person's Guide to Religion and Faithful Reason. Closer to home, he served for many years as the chair of trustees of the Royal Institute of Philosophy, stepped down only a few years ago, and he's about the closest thing we've got to the Royal Institute's official historian. And this evening he's going to interweave some details of our history with more general philosophical reflections. His talk is entitled...
The Most Permanent Interests of the Human Spirit.
You heard it from him.
Can I just check that this is amplifying, is it? This microphone is picking me up and you're getting all of that. Very good. Actually, I should sort of update the CV, as it were. I'm actually now teaching in Rome, at two universities in Rome. And in fact, I flew last night from Rome and will be flying back in the morning to Rome. So I finished a graduate class at 4:30, quite close to the Forum, and then struggled to get out of Rome. It is a struggle to get out of Rome at that time of the day, and made my way here, which is nice to do. As it turned out, this I hadn't anticipated at all, but this is a slight clash of commitments. But of course, I have to honour this one, because this evening in Hanover Square, there's the opening of a very fine exhibition of paintings by David Hockney. And I went to Paris recently to see the Hockney exhibition there, and I'm an admirer of Hockney's. Anyway, I called in today, and fortunately, since the gallery already knew me from past occasions and so on, I got a sort of, I was left alone in the gallery. It wasn't actually opening till this evening, but I had the space to myself. But then I had to race to the Royal Watercolour Society, because another artist about whose work I've written in the past, his exhibition was opening and so on. In fact, it was worse than that, because I'd actually written part of the catalogue of the exhibition that opens tonight and so on. Well, it opened half an hour ago. But anyway, so I've had to take in what would have been two exhibition openings, which turned out not to be exhibition openings, but me pretty much on my own wandering around these galleries. But I did manage to say nice things to the artist. Anyway, so thank you very much for this invitation. And I'm very happy to contribute to this series in this centenary year of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. My remarks this evening are going to be divided, actually you put it rather well, Edward, which is to say they're going to be sort of woven together, are going to be historical remarks and philosophical remarks. And I suppose, to anticipate in a way my conclusion, I want to offer a moderate defence of philosophical idealism. And the relevance of that in the historical dimension is that many of the figures who were influential in the period when the Royal Institute were founded were themselves, as it were, the last generation of philosophical idealists. Anyway, we'll get there in the end. I suppose I just can't forbear looking at this very young audience and so on, opening up by sort of remembering a couple of occasions, perhaps only one occasion, we don't want to be too distracted, of my first encounters with the Royal Institute of Philosophy. This would, I suppose, I think, have been in the 1970s. And I went along sort of Friday evening in Gordon Square. And there used at that time, part of the audience was made up of a group of people who looked as if they might be either on their way to a cocktail party or had returned from the cocktail party, having spent quite a bit of time there. And there was rather Edwardian looking figures who I remember one of them, he would always come in a dinner suit and so on, but also, and that looked very sort of stylish, except it was very worn and shiny and all this kind of thing. But he also carried what was evidently his shopping, so you can see carrots and sort of, frozen food and all the rest of it in there. And he took it upon himself, he saw himself, as it were, as the representative of sanity and profundity on the part of the audience. So whenever anybody gave a talk, he would always stand up first. And rather in the style of a parliamentarian, or a rather pompous parliamentarian, he would always just sort of look around. He would grip his, he would grip his lapel, and he would look to right and left before he sort of issued a question or a statement. I remember anyway, on one occasion, the lecture was being given by the then professor of philosophy and chair of the philosophy department at Birkbeck, who was also then chair of the classics department and vice master of the college, and also editor of Mind. So this was somebody who had sort of many commitments and was obviously an accomplished person. Anyway, his talk that day was to do with the question of perception and sensation. This is a very interesting philosophical issue, which I'm not going to touch on now really, but safe to say that the question is really, are sensations, merely being a sensory state, does that constitute some sort of perception or does it not? Anyway, by way of illustration, he, David Hamlin, said that, for example, if you entered a hot bath in a cold bathroom, and then you would have certain sort of sensations, and then if you came out of this, you'd have certain sensations, and so on. And it was meant to, but he was wanting to say these are not perceptions, they're merely sensations, and so on. Anyway, the man who was evidently agitated by this, the leader of the pack, as it were, he then, at the end, got up, grasped his lapels, looked to left and right, and he said, well, I have to say, I don't know about your experiences, sir, but I can tell you that when I come out of a hot bath, my flesh is pink and swollen and so on. And then he embarked on this description, which was particularly uncomfortable for all of us, because you were trying to he was, as it were, mentally stripping himself. So you imagined him, combined with this rather carrier bag full of things. Anyway, those were the heyday of the Royal Institute of Philosophy. And I'm sorry it's descended to this point where you've got a bunch of people who actually are interested and are here to talk about things. Anyway, so let me get underway. Centenaries of academic, cultural and educational... Oh, by the way, I shall begin reading and at some point I will abandon that and then I will be sort of slightly free in talking about some philosophical issues. Centenaries of academic, cultural and educational institutions are typically occasions for celebration, recollection and a degree of prognostication. So here I'll present some material about the genesis and development of the organisation founded originally as the British Institute of Philosophical Studies and later retitled the Royal Institute of Philosophy, and celebrate some of its achievements. I shall also look to the future a little, but in general my approach will not be that of an institutional chronicler, for my interest is in situating the founding of the Institute and the statement of its purposes within its social, educational and philosophical context. I'll also consider the proximately prior institutional development of philosophy in Britain and the way in which it has developed in subsequent decades, where it stands today and what role the Institute might play in influencing philosophical reflection and development within and beyond British universities. Well, these matters will be made more specific and substantial as I proceed, but I should say ahead of some historical narrative that my ultimate interest is broadly philosophical. For a long time, it did not occur to British philosophers to consider the influence of personal, cultural and social factors in shaping the content and development of ideas. Or they dismissed the matter as a superficial distraction from the pursuit of philosophy itself, or as a case of fallaciously supposing that the rationality of a belief may be judged by reference to its source and consequence rather than its intrinsic merit, in effect conflating reasons as warrants with reasons as causes. Well, this attitude overlooked the important fact, observed in different ways by Vico, by Hegel, by Marx and by Wittgenstein, and first emphasised in a widely read book by Alistair MacIntyre 60 years ago. This is not After Virtue, it's his outline of the history of ethics. The point pressed by him that concepts are embodied in and partly constitutive of forms of social life. and spheres of activity and inquiry. Hence, concepts are transformed as social life and those spheres themselves change. Now, admittedly, MacIntyre was concerned with moral concepts, and that may be thought to be a special case. But in fact, the application to culture and politics is evident, I mean, the same point being made in respect to those, and the general point, I think, elaborated by reference to different factors, extends to folk psychology and everyday ideas about the world more generally, as these are drawn upon or made the subject of philosophical analyses and arguments. I'll just give one passing example. I've recently been writing about perception among some medieval authors, and one thing that becomes quite clear, I mean, not perhaps initially clear, because one just doesn't think this would be an issue, but becomes increasingly clear, is that these medieval authors had no concept of experience. There's a term that they use very widely, experimentum. Aquinas, for example, uses it 300 times in his discussions and so on. But what they don't have, and what Aristotle doesn't have, is something that has come to be dominant in recent philosophy, namely the idea of a subjective state, let's just call it an experiential state, where there's a further question about the relationship of that state to the world. They simply don't have that concept. For them, experience is what you might call observation. You might say, well, his knowledge is based on experience, but that really means sort of accumulated knowledge through observation and so on. But it is interesting when you start to look at the history of these things that the sort of naivety of thinking, well, we just engage with these philosophical questions and the concepts are given, and it's one thing and another. Given from where, I've no idea, but anyway, they're given. But in fact, these concepts have a history, and that history reflects various sorts of factors. Well, that's something I'll come back to later on. The former British reluctance to engage in historically contextualized hermeneutics, that's to say, interpreting through an historical context, in reading authors and their ideas and arguments, may seem now to be a thing of the past, when one considers the recent spate of book-length studies of individuals, John Austin, Derek Parfit, and Ramsay, groups, Anscombe, Foote, Murdoch and Midgley, and generations, Oxonians in the war years and through the 20th century. And those books, well, some of you will know those. I'm thinking of Rose, Austin, philosopher and D-Day intelligence officer, Edmonds, Parfit, a philosopher and his mission to save humanity, Gerald Meshack, Frank Ramsay, a sheer excess of powers, Benjamin Lipscomb, The Women Are Up to Something, Claire McCool and Rachel Wiseman, Metaphysical Animals, Nikhil Krishnan, who I think gave a talk recently, A Terribly Serious Adventure, Philosophy and War at Oxford. All of these, by the way, or almost all of them, were published in 2023. This is a rather recent phenomenon. However, with the exception of another book, Christoph Scheringer's Social History of Analytic Philosophy, published this year, these various works that I've described, or referred to at any rate, are essentially biographical studies. They contrast in this respect with a book, little known in Britain actually, Randall Collins' 1,100-page opus of a quarter century ago, The Sociology of Philosophies, which, besides being global rather than parochial in scope, also develops a theory of intellectual change. While not reducing ideas and arguments to the effects or manifestations of social or economic forces, which Scheringer tends towards in his ideological critique of analytical philosophy, Collins' study nevertheless remains an external analysis, noting general tendencies and structural patterns, such as the construction of what he terms abstraction reflexivity sequences. That's to say, in which themes and topics are recast in increasingly abstract form, detaching them from the experiences and practices that gave rise to them in the first instance. And then, he says, in the resulting contest, this isn't a quote, it's a glossing, but in the resulting contest between competing theories and doctrines, there's either mutual exhaustion, defeat, or relatively greater success, leading to a meta-theoretical, higher level ascent to a viewpoint from which the prior contest is then redescribed. Now, this account may remind some of you of Hegel's dialectic and of MacIntyre's later account of the contest between traditions. But in being a merely formal characterization, it does not, nor does it claim to engage with or account for the subject matter at issue, or explain the emergence, rise, decline, or revival of ideas. For that, a kind of analysis is required that spans content and causality. The causality here would be more formal and final than efficient and material. Causality and contexts. Now, these are matters to which I will return briefly, but first, some history. In celebration of the first half of the founding of the Institute, Gilbert Ryle, then a leading philosopher in Britain and had long been, gave a lecture at King's College London in 1976 titled 50 Years of Philosophy and Philosophers. He began his reflections by observing that the date of the Institute's establishment coincided with the beginning of his own career. That's to say, 1924-25. That date coincided with the beginning of his own career as a professional philosopher, and he proceeded to recall the state of British philosophy at that time, the time when he entered it, in 24 now, 100 years ago. Then going on to chart significant changes of personnel, of interest, of methods, and of institutional embodiment across the subsequent decades. Now, I'll just here sort of summarize what these reflections of his in that lecture fall into two categories. On the one hand, there are observations of where things stood in philosophy at the time that he entered it and the time in which the Institute was created. And then the second category consists really of comments on subsequent developments. So let me actually begin by summarizing what he has to say in the latter category, that's to say the subsequent developments, and then return to the earlier years. He talks about a generational shift. He actually uses the phrase the old gang. These are the people who were senior philosophers when he was just entering into academic philosophy in 1924. He said they were often, and I'm quoting now, the academic offspring of those dominating Scots teachers who had rooted philosophy in so many of the universities of the UK and the English-speaking university abroad, what he describes as great Doric-tongued educators. And then he says of this new generation of which he was a part, that it was less formal, more light-hearted, more open to conceptual experimentation. Now, there's something else he observes that I think is interesting and important, and it's worth bearing this in mind, which was the sense of a loss through the 1914-18 war of a number of philosophers, and particularly younger people who might then have gone on to have distinguished careers and made great contributions. And also, and this is sort of less obvious in a way, but nonetheless was very real, the anticipation among his generation of another war. And people knew there was another war coming. When it would come, they didn't quite know, but at any rate. And that this produced in his generation a kind of hurried ambition. That's my phrase, not his, but they wanted to get on with it as well. Now, he then talks about one or two other sort of institutional developments. So one was the development of modern greats at Oxford. And that changed the curriculum and the syllabi. Up to that point, or close to that point, the way in which you did philosophy, for the most part, was through classics. You would do literae humaniores. What you would do is you would study ancient cultures, particularly the cultures of Greece and Rome, and part of that study would be a study of the works of these great philosophers. But the modern greats changed that, or at least provided an alternative route in which you could study figures such as Locke and so on. Now, this introduction of a new course, or a new part of a general program of studies, actually gave rise to a need for more tutors. So it produced the beginnings of a kind of increase in the population of philosophers at Oxford. But then the next thing that happened, and which he has some comments to make about, is what I'll just call the Great Expansion. This really happens after 1945. And it has really three elements or components. One is the new universities. So these are being created throughout the country, and of course, staff are needed for teaching in one thing and another. Second, the graduate tide, as he describes it. This is the beginning of graduate studies. Now, graduate studies in arts and humanities, that concept originates, it's partly a Germanic concept, but it originates in the English-speaking world at Johns Hopkins University in the United States. But up to that point, nobody thought of doing graduate studies in philosophy. In fact, I think I probably belong, well, I'm not quite sure, but it's the last generation whose teachers did not have doctorates. the people who taught me, just had first degrees, and they would be appointed into position within 1 or 2 years of completing their undergraduate studies. Maybe a little longer, they might have had sort of temporary positions in one thing and another. But the graduate tide really began to change all of that. And then the third component, so the new universities, the graduate tide, and then the third element was academic visitors. Because of the preeminence of Oxford in the English-speaking world in philosophy, many of those graduates who were enrolling in graduate programs in the United States wanted to spend some time in the UK, and specifically in Oxford. And of course, so also did their teachers. And so you began to get this practice of academic visitors who would come for a term or whatever, as much as a year. That actually was reciprocated because they would invite back some of the Oxford people to their home universities and so on. And you get this international travel. Donald Davidson, a philosopher will be known to many of you, when he was in Stanford, invited over a very large number of British philosophers, and he was very sort of enamoured of that. But also there were many students who came to Oxford to study. I've talked about graduate students, but also as undergraduates. John Searle, for example, and Thomas Nagel would be among those. So what this resulted in, says Ryle, is a kind of greater pluralism of interests and of attitudes. And this, he thinks, led to a detachment from certain historical allegiances and oppositions that existed in British philosophy up to that point. He talks about the end of isms, but I think this is slightly disingenuous, because what he really means is the death of idealism and the survival of his own favourite view, which was an anti-idealistic view. He talks about the end of isms. Yeah, I mean, he thought that the story of isms was over because the principal opponent was dead, being killed off and so on. Well, I'll come back to that. And then, of course, he talks about, as one would have to then, the influence of formal logic. This is all in the transformation of the way in which philosophy is thought about and studied. But finally, he touches on what he calls philosopher missionaries. This is something he sees as a development that had gone on in the decades during which he himself had a career. And I'll just quote this. He says, "There survived in my day," this is Ryle speaking, "there survived in my day the idea that philosophy had the prime justification for its existence in its being a sort of missionary calling. Behind and above the pedagogic duties for which he was salaried, the academic philosopher, no less than the lay philosopher, had the permanent duty to do good by homily and example to the man in the street." He continues, "I fancy that a few of the promoters and several of the early supporters of the Institute of Philosophy itself were influenced by intermittent but rosy versions of some acts of edification and inspiration issuing out of the philanthropically unbolted doors of our philosophy departments into the home and haunts of the common man." I'm just going to read that again. He said, "I fancy that a few of the promoters and several of the early supporters of our Institute of Philosophy itself were influenced by intermittent but rosy visions of some acts of edification and inspiration issuing out of the philanthropically unbolted doors of our philosophy departments into the home and haunts of the common man. Apart from inducing a bit of self-esteem in its lay gospelers, this missionary undertaking did little harm." Now, I have to say, these sentiments, how they were received on the occasion of a celebration of the Institute of Philosophy, I'm not sure. But this whole thing just reeks of condescension, complacency, and dismissal. And it's as well that the principal agent in the founding of the Institute, somebody called Hooper, who I shall mention again in a moment, wasn't still alive at the time at which these reflections were delivered. Well, let me turn now back to the earlier part of his reflections, when he's recalling what philosophy was like in his when he entered it in 24-25, the same year as the founding of the Institute of Philosophy. Well, eschewing the task of describing the Institute's history, as he says, being for someone else to provide, Ryle allowed that he had, and I quote, some rare qualifications for describing the philosophical world into which it was born. The philosophical world at the end of the first quarter of the 20th century. Now these qualifications, as he described them, related to the fact that he, Ryle, and his fellow then junior philosophers had had varying degrees of acquaintance with such figures as MacTaggart, G. E. Moore, Russell, C. D. Broad, Wittgenstein and Ramsay, Pritchard, H. W. B. Joseph, W. D. Ross, F. C. S. Schiller, H. J. Peyton and R. G. Collingwood, and G. F. Stout, Samuel Alexander, A. E. Taylor, Norman Kemp Smith, G. Dawes Hicks and Susan Stebbing. Now, in extracting names from, I've extracted those from his longer list, I've selected those certain or most likely to be recognised, if at all. But in several cases, I've added initials to make identification more probable. I mean, some of these names, if you just said Schiller, I just think people wouldn't know that. I'm not sure adding FCS does a lot to help with that, but at any rate. Now, the fact, of course, is that many whom Ryle mentioned were fading from memory even as he spoke of them, and are now only known to a few specialists, which itself is an instructive reminder of how uncertain are academic reputations, even in the short term. Sort of memento mori, as it were. Additionally, Ryle does not explain the grouping of the names. Perhaps he assumed that his audience would identify the basis for it. Some perhaps will still do so, in part recognising that the first two groupings are of philosophers at Cambridge and Oxford, respectively. But fewer will appreciate that among these are several Scottish philosophers, and among the last groupings are philosophers from Scottish universities. The remainder being figures from Manchester, Samuel Alexander, and from London, George Dawes Hicks of UCL, and Susan Stebbing of Bedford College, no longer existent, that college. Now, this distribution, I think, is significant for understanding the institutional embodiment of British philosophy in 1924. That was the year in which Ryle graduated with a triple first, spanning classical literature and history, philosophy, politics, and economics. And the year he was appointed lecturer in philosophy at Christ Church, and then the following year elected a fellow and a tutor of the college. From that point on, he rose steadily, becoming the main pioneer and leader of informal ordinary language philosophy, and in due course becoming Waynflete Professor and editor of Mind, and exercising considerable influence over the style and conception of philosophy within and beyond Oxford, through personal example and power of patronage. 1924 was the same year in which an enthusiastic amateur, Sidney E. Hooper, embarked on his contribution to the promotion of philosophy. At his own initiative, Hooper wrote to a number of those whose names I've listed, and others, asking if they would support the creation of an institute in London for the study of philosophy. At that point, and this is something worth emphasising, at that point there were only a dozen or so English, Welsh and Northern Irish universities, though some were composite entities with constituent institutions, and additional regional colleges submitted students for London degrees as external students. With the exception of Oxford and Cambridge, these other dozen or so universities were all 19th or early 20th century establishments. Scotland then had 4 universities, St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen and Edinburgh, but they were all ancient, 3 from the 15th and 1, Edinburgh, from the 16th centuries. Most of the UK departments were small, though those in Scotland, where there were typically 2 departments in each university, ones of logic and metaphysics and of moral philosophy, respectively, were proportionately larger due to the fact that the study of philosophy was effectively compulsory for first-year undergraduates in the faculties of arts, something only finally abandoned within living memory. Now, in addition, there was a tradition in the Scottish universities of open lectures given by distinguished visiting academics and literary figures, attendances at which were often large and included members of the public as well as teachers and students. In 1847, the lawyer Adam, later Lord Gifford, attended a series of talks in Edinburgh by Ralph Waldo Emerson, and had his thinking, as he says, directed towards metaphysics and transcendentalism. Now, by transcendentalism, he meant the movement with which Emerson was associated that combined elements of romanticism, creative individualism, idealism, spirituality, and social reform. Inspired by the content of those talks, and by the idea that philosophical notions and arguments might be made available in this way, Gifford made generous provision in his will for the establishment in each of the 4 ancient Scottish universities, and those were the only universities in Scotland at the time, of, I quote, lectureships or classes for the promotion of the study of the being, nature, and attributes of the infinite, and of the relations of man and the universe to it, and of the true foundation of all ethics and morals, and for the teaching and diffusion of sound views regarding them among the whole population of Scotland. From the outset of the Gifford Lectures, which began at the end of the 1880s, the Gifford Lectures, which began at the end of the 1880s, were given by invited academics in the fields of philosophy and theology, then broadening out in later decades. By 1924, some 40 series of lectures had been delivered, and I should say these series of lectures would be 12 or so lectures. It wasn't 2 or 3 lectures, it would be 12 lectures. 40 had been delivered across Scotland to mixed academic and general public audiences, many by leading British and international philosophers, including William James, Josiah Royce, Bernard Bosanquet, Samuel Alexander, and Henri Bergson. Now, several relevant points, I think, lie within the various foregoing facts. First, the scale of academic philosophy in Britain in 1924-25 was relatively small and confined to a few centres of population, with most students being non-residential and living at home. By contrast, the British Philosophical Association, only established in 2003, currently lists as members 46 departments of philosophy from across the country. Second, in England, the study of the subject by university students was generally still novel and a matter of choice of degree study. As a result, philosophy was not part of general educated culture in England. In Scotland, by contrast, where the subject had been taught continuously for 500 years, where a greater proportion of the population attended university, and where enrolment in at least first-year moral philosophy was hard to avoid, the numbers emerging with at least some knowledge of the subject was significant, and from the 1890s supplemented by Gifford's lay audiences. Third, and relatedly, there was in Scotland a philosophical tradition involving the overlap of figures and ideas, and importantly, two-way connections with continental Europe, which in philosophy in Scotland had begun in the 16th century. I could just mention one graduate from the University of St Andrews, John Hay, went to Poland, well, what we now call Poland, Lithuania, and established the School of Philosophy in Vilnius, in present-day Lithuania, in the third quarter of the 16th century. But this was part of traffic that was toing and froing. Kant, by the way, believed that his grandfather was a Scot from the Aberdeenshire Cant family, C-A-N-T. He was wrong about that. But I mean, the point is, it's conceivable that he could have been. There was a lot of toing and froing between Scotland and continental Europe. Although this tradition, the Scottish tradition, began before the 18th century, it was in that period that it intensified and came to international prominence through the work of Francis Hutcheson, David Hume, Adam Smith, Thomas Reid, and Adam Ferguson, and as many again of the second rank. In the following century, the 19th century, the tradition continued, but began to move from empiricism and realism towards idealism, initially through the work of Sir William Hamilton, a man it was often said of him, he knew more than any other living human being. Sir William Hamilton, who followed Kant, and then in that of James Frederick Ferrier, very interesting philosopher, who was in St Andrews, Edinburgh and St Andrews. By the way, we owe the term epistemology to Ferrier. He introduced it in one of his works. But if Hamilton was influenced by Kant, Ferrier was influenced by Hegel. In fact, it was Ferrier who brought Hegelian philosophy to Britain in the first instance. The upshot then was that many of the Scots philosophers working in Scotland and in England in the 1920s espoused various forms of idealism, philosophical, and I'll say later what I mean by idealism. These then formed the majority of pre-1925 Scots Gifford lectures. So most of the philosophical lectures in pre-25 were given by Scots idealists: John Laird, Richard Haldane, Andrew Seth Pringle-Pattison, William Sorley, and J.H. Stirling. Fourth, chairs in philosophy in England were a relatively recent institution. The White's Professorship in Moral Philosophy at Oxford and the Knightsbridge Chair at Cambridge being the exceptions. Both of those were established in the 17th century, in 1621 and 1683 respectively, but they only came to distinction in the 19th century with the appointment of T.H. Green, an idealist, in Oxford in 1878, and of Henry Sidgwick, an empiricist, at Cambridge in 1883. And it was only in 1859 that Oxford created two further philosophy professorships, the Wickham Chair in Logic and the Waynflete Chair in Metaphysics. Returning to Ryle's final group, those whom he mentions were themselves firsts in university philosophy. Samuel Alexander, the first Jewish fellow of an Oxbridge college and the first professor of philosophy at Manchester; George Dawes Hicks, the first holder of the chair of moral philosophy at UCL. It had been created in 1827, but remained vacant until his appointment in 1904. And Susan Stebbing, the first female professor of philosophy in the UK and founder in 1933 of the journal Analysis. Such then was the situation with academic philosophy when in 1924 Sidney Hooper, man I mentioned earlier, believing that there was a need to make the subject available beyond the confines of the few universities in which it was then on the curriculum, conceived the idea of an institution that would teach and encourage research in the subject, conveying the latter to an interested public through sets of lectures to be delivered in central London, and subsequently through a publication that would contain or report on such material. In his efforts to secure support for this, or to conceive the idea of it and persuade others of the value of this, and then in his efforts to secure financial support for it, it was there that he introduced the idea that philosophy served the most permanent interests of the human spirit. This was how he characterized, at least in part characterized it, or to enumerate one of its functions. Now here I think it's relevant to add a further presence and likely stimulus to his thinking. Although access to higher education in England was very limited, there began to develop in the 19th century a series of bodies that sought to introduce the public to ideas relevant to understanding human life and conduct, and to provide fora for their discussion. In the first half of the 19th century, several of the liberal utilitarians who supported the foundation of University College, specifically George Birkbeck and Henry Brown, who'd both studied at Edinburgh University, were also involved in the creation of the Society for the Promotion of Useful Knowledge and the Mechanics Institutes, the latter first in Glasgow and then in London. Although the Society and the Mechanics Institutes were not concerned with philosophical education, they both aimed to encourage study and support of self-development. More directly related to philosophy were the ethical societies. Often residually Christian, for example, Unitarian, then by stages agnostic, then atheist, the leaders and members of these put on events that had listed created societies and then put on events that had listed large memberships and offered classes open to the public and produced pamphlets reporting lectures and serving as prompts for discussion. These were well known to people like Russell and Hooper and others involved in the founding and support of the Institute, and will have had some influence, I think, on their thinking. Let me just say a word about Hooper himself. Sidney Ernest Hooper was born in 1880 and studied at Durham and London. Although the former university, founded in 1832, was the third oldest of the English universities, it was not until 1910 that it established a chair in philosophy, to which its then Vice-Chancellor, Frank Jevons, was appointed. Prior to that, philosophy was taught mainly in connection with classics or theology, as elsewhere, and it would have been in those contexts that Hooper encountered it, if he did. Durham was an Anglican foundation, and many students went there with a view to proceeding to train for ordained ministry. That had been Hooper's own intent, but he came to feel that he couldn't subscribe unreservedly to Christian doctrines, and by stages he lost his faith. What remained, however, and could then be pursued without the burden of doubt, was his intense interest in questions about the nature of reality and the place of human beings within it. Hooper was not and did not become an academic philosopher, but he read widely and he communicated effectively with leading figures of the period, enlisting their support and participation. The response was positive, but for the idea to be realised, it needed a home that would serve as a venue for lectures and a base for organisation, and shortly as an editorial office for the Institute's journal. All of that required funding, and he lacked the means to do so, but in the event, his enthusiasm, dedication and persistence delivered a location in what was then called University Hall. It had been built as a residence for UCL, and then the Williams Library had moved in there and so on, but that's where he had his office, and indeed until quite recently that's where the Royal Institute was located. He found a benefactor to support all of this, somebody called Mr. Emile Gark, who reported, rather nicely this, he reported that he had received an anonymous cheque, Gark reported, he'd received an anonymous cheque for £500 in support of the establishment of this. Of course, Gark was himself the source of that £500 cheque. By the way, £500, you might think, well, that's not a lot to get something going. £500 then is worth £40,000 today. And I should, I don't know if I said about the value of, I think I skipped it, but the value of the money that Gifford left for the establishment of a series of lectures in each of the ancient Scottish universities would be about £15 million in contemporary terms. Now, I was going to go on to talk more about aspects of the history of the Institute, but actually I'm going to stop doing that, and I'm going to talk briefly now about something else, which is something philosophical. Now, I should explain here that the world that Ryle was talking about when he came into it, and then the decades that he describes subsequent to that, were ones that had seen the defeat of the idealist philosophical tradition, and initially its replacement by a kind of realism, and then, and this was part of Ryle's point, he then thought that people, as it were, had disengaged from, and indeed rightly disengaged from, these kinds of oppositions, ism oppositions, realism, idealism, and so on. He thought that had been achieved because philosophy, the purpose of philosophy, had been reconceived in a way that meant it was no longer involved in those battles, because its method was now one of clarification, analysis, and so on. So let me just say a little bit about that issue, because I think it's important to see where that arose and what it gave rise to, which to some extent is still with us today. The rejection of idealism came, principally, was located in Cambridge with G.E. Moore and Russell. I'll say a little bit perhaps about what arguments they gave to refute it, but what did it give rise to? Well, as I say, initially, the defeat of, since idealism seemed to be opposed to something called philosophical realism, so let's just say in very rough terms, the philosophical idealist thinks that in some sense and to some degree, at least to what extent and to what degree will differentiate different kinds of idealists, that reality, or the reality that we're concerned with at any rate, is essentially mental in some sense. Right? That reality is structured, we can put it this way, ideationally in terms of certain kinds of concepts and so on. We're not talking about experience of reality, we're talking about reality itself. That the thing that we engage with is in some sense a sort of mind-dependent reality. Now, as I say, to some extent and various degrees and so on, such like. The realist in contrast, wants to say, no, what we engage with, or if we're successful in engaging with it at any rate, is something wholly independent of ourselves. The reality is antecedent, prior to and antecedent to us, and we open our eyes, or whatever it is we do, through our senses we engage with it, we come to form knowledge of it, and so on. So that's basically the opposition. The idealist, as I say, thinks that there's a kind of attunement between human consciousness and the structure of reality, and that's because the structure of reality is itself a kind of mental, has the characteristics of mind, let's just put it like that. Now, what was the result then of the rejection of idealism? Well, for a short period, it was the seeming triumph of realism. That's to say, people thought, no, right, so this is how we have to think about philosophy, our epistemology, our metaphysics, every bit of our philosophy has to be understood, broadly speaking, in realist terms. That's to say, we're engaging with something that is independent of us, and the question is what character and features does it have, and so on. But very quickly, as it happened, the realist impulse, I mean, the strong passion for realism just seemed to wither. But something was left that was a consequence of the rejection of idealism, which was a conception of what the task of philosophy was. And the task of philosophy in this way of thinking was to describe our concepts, essentially. Now, I'll give just briefly 2 or 3 examples of this. I mean, one example, for instance, is G.E. Moore himself in The Sphere of Ethics, where he says that the task of philosophy in relation to ethics is not, as it were, a normative one. It's not to work out what's right and what's wrong, what's good and what's bad, what things are good, what things are bad, what actions are right, what actions are wrong. It's to understand what goodness itself is. And so he spends a fair amount of time trying to give some analysis and trying to give ways in which we could try to understand what goodness is. And one of the principal things he wants to say is that we mustn't confuse goodness with what might be the good-making qualities of a thing. So whatever the qualities were of a thing, in virtue of which it was good, its being good was something over and above those qualities. And so the task of the philosopher is really to sort of leave behind the specificities and the particularities of the moral or the ethical and so on, and just think about these central concepts, the concepts of good or right and so on. Now this way of thinking about the matter migrated actually from Cambridge, where he was, to Oxford. And there was a generation of Oxford philosophers, W.D. Ross, Pritchard, and others, who sort of followed Moore in this. So what we end up with is a view of moral philosophy as essentially descriptive, not normative. And this was carried through even when people sort of gave up the sort of realism that Moore avowed in the ethical domain. People through to Stevenson and Hare and so on, although they differed in their account of these concepts, they thought the task of philosophy was just to describe and articulate the structure of them. By the way, in political philosophy, there was something similar, though this is less well known, and that's the influence of Oakeshott, who himself had been at Cambridge and took a view about political philosophy or political theory that it was exclusively a descriptive task. It wasn't a normative task. And this had great influence at the LSE, where he was appointed. And that influence continued until, relatively recently, through a number of people, but principally Kenneth Minogue, who was a professor at the LSE, who took the same view of the task of political thinking. It was to try to understand the structure of political thought. It wasn't to engage, as it were, normatively in trying to determine and so on. This, by the way, was seen to induce a kind of conservatism about institutions and their activities, because we're not critically engaging with them, we're just describing them, aren't we just leaving them as they were? Well, leaving things as they were is precisely what Wittgenstein said philosophy would do. And if we move through to the 50s now, it's what Strawson said in his introduction to his book Individuals. He contrasted 2 kinds of metaphysics, one he called revisionary, and the other one he called descriptive, and said that his work was an exercise in descriptive metaphysics, an attempt just to describe the different concepts that we have about space, time, individuals, and so on. Now, let me just say briefly, the argument against idealism that was felt to have destroyed it, was to do with relationality. So one of the prominent idealists, the most leading idealist arguably in England in the period prior to the attack, was Bradley. And Bradley's argument was that if we start to think about things, we see that these things are in relation to one another. So we've got things and we've got the relations between things. But we can't really describe the things independently of the relations in which they stand to other things, and we can't describe the relations independently of the things that stand in relations. And so what he thought emerged from this was a picture of reality as a single totality. That it's not really a set of discrete objects, it is, as it were, a single object, connected together by non-contingent bonds, as it were. And he thought that this exhibited something like a mind-like structure, as it were. Reality was organized somewhat in the way in which ideas are organized. They stand in inferential relations and so on and such like. I mean, we think that the relations that logic represents are not contingent relations between the contents of propositions. We think that they are precisely logical relations. And his argument had been that if we think about relationality in general, this will lead us to see that the world is not a set of discrete independent objects, it's a set of object relations, if you like, that constitute a totality. And that totality, therefore, represents something mind-like, as it were, because it has the same sort of relations that we find in thought. And in fact, this is no accident, because it were, thought is just the determination of the individual mind, quotes individual mind, by this overall structure. Now, the argument against that, principally, was that it's a sort of fallacy to go from the fact that certain things can be described, certain things can be described as standing in certain sorts of relations, to the idea that there are relational things. So Russell and Moore were very concerned to try to reassert the idea of a world of independent objects. I mean, independent of us and independent of one another. This, by the way, this dialectic is, I was just thinking about this today, and it occurred to me that this dialectic was replayed in the 1960s in the debate in the philosophy of action between those who thought that reasons are not causes of actions and those, most famously, Donald Davidson, who thought they were. And there was an argument that the people who thought that reasons are not causes of actions often deployed. I'm not sure they used this term, but it came to be used in description of their move, which was called the logical connection argument. And the argument was that since the relationship between reasons, my reason for doing something and my doing it, is a logical relationship, as it were. It's an internal relationship. I'm going to have to find a way of doing this, sorry. It's an internal relationship. That's Rome. It's my wife wondering where I am. It's an internal relationship. I'm wondering where I am. It's an internal relationship. Now, Davidson famously in his paper Actions, Reasons and Causes makes a move that's very like the move that Russell makes against Bradley, which is to say, look, from the fact that you can describe reasons and actions in ways that the reason refers to the action, it doesn't follow that the things stand in that relation. So the things can be independent, and so therefore one can be the cause of the other. I mean, what I want to say about that is that this is, I think, a rather glib and superficial response to what the underlying thought was in idealism. So let me just end briefly by saying something about idealism. And this is where it's to sort of extend the dialectic. So we started in 1924 with Ryle congratulating himself and his colleagues on having swept away, well, the earlier generation has swept away idealism, and then we get a kind of philosophy that becomes a sort of quietism, as it were. It's not its business, it's just its descriptive and such like. We have, of course, had a revival of normative ethics. We've had a revival of substantial metaphysics and such like. That very much went on during the 1970s and 80s. But I want to sort of draw this to a close by saying I think it's time to reconsider idealism. Now, let me just try to make clear the kind of idealism that I have in mind. What it recognizes, or where it begins, is by recognizing that in certain spheres, the relations between things are not relations between discrete entities. So let me just, I'll just give 3 examples very briefly, one epistemology, one metaphysics, and one social philosophy. So in epistemology, the realist produced a picture according to which there is, as it were, a gap between cognition and reality. There's stuff on that, and this is not unconnected with the concept of experience that I talked about earlier on. There are certain states that we are in, and the question is, what's the relation of those states to the world? And it's a very common story to say the relationship is causal, right? That in some sense the external environment produces certain effects in our sense faculties and so on, and the strength of this, we, by somewhat mysterious processes, but at any rate, we end up with beliefs about the external world. Now, I think there's a way of treating that seems to be an unnecessary kind of dualism, akin, by the way, to mind-body dualism. Strawson, in his book on individuals, I think insightfully prefers to speak about mental and physical aspects or properties rather than to talk about mental and physical objects. And I think the notion of, as it were, the mental and the physical, in ways in which people conceive the mind-body problem, involves a kind of reification, turning things into entities that are actually aspects. So what I'd want to say in relation to the mind-body question is, well, the mental is an aspect of me and the bodily is an aspect of me, but there are not 2 things there that compose this entity. But nor can you eliminate one in favour of the other. But likewise, in the case of cognition, I think it's worth, and this isn't the occasion to try to do this way, but I think it's worth thinking about the concepts of subject and object in cognition in somewhat similar way. So let's take this where the cognitive activity as being the primary thing, and then think of the concept of a subject, the thinker, as it were, and the concept of the object, the thing thought of, as it were, abstractions from this primary thing, which is a certain kind of activity. Now, that thought is developed interestingly by Ferrier, the chap I spoke of earlier on, in Criticism of Hume. But interestingly, there's something somewhat similar to be found in a more recent and highly influential philosopher, namely John McDowell. Some of you might know McDowell's work, Mind and World, and subsequent work, and so on. And McDowell has in this the thought that, as he puts it, our thoughts about the world don't stop short of the world itself. And he's been accused, therefore, or thereby, as being a kind of idealist. That's to say, of thinking that, one way of putting this, is sort of the identity theory of truth, right? That the content of my thought just is the structure that the thought brings to me, as it were, the structure of the world. Well, since my thoughts are conceptually articulated, doesn't it look as if the world has to be something like conceptually articulated in order for that to be that identity? Now, McDowell has sought to sort of defend himself against the charge of idealism, though some people think not altogether effectively. But I'm inclined to say don't be too worried about that. I was going to give further examples from social philosophy and metaphysics, but I think I'll stop and they can come up in question or something if you like. But here's the kind of idealism that I think is plausible. And it has implications for philosophy generally, and it has implications for the Institute. The kind of idealism that I think is plausible is to say something like this. Look, the world as far as we're concerned with it, because the concept of the world is itself a sort of abstraction, but the thing that we deal with is conceptualized in certain ways, does have a conceptual structure, but the reason it has a conceptual structure is because, as it were, its relation to us is not a causal one in some sense. I don't want to say it's a I don't want to say that we construct the world, but I do want to say that our experience of the world is perceptual, and that perceptual experience is a kind of conceptualized form of cognition. And so the world comes to us through categories that are conceptual categories, not causal categories. And that the world, therefore, for us is, as it were, the human world. And most of the things that we are concerned with, whether whether it's objects, whether it's values and so on, are, as it were, real in the ideal sense. They are constituents of this world, but this world is as it were, a blend of the grounds, the external grounds of this possibility, and what it is that our sensibility does in response to those grounds. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but certainly we can't. But what I do want to just make two little steps. One, why I think this is important and what I think its implications are. I think it's important because it offers the possibility of recovering a kind of humanism. One of the great things about the 19th century philosophers that I've mentioned, the idealist philosophers, in particular the Scottish philosophers, I would say that, excuse me, is they were all great humanists. I mean, that is to say, they had a very strong sense of common humanity. It's no action. They were social reformers. They also were sort of communitarians in their political theory and such like. And it's a slightly depressing fact that philosophy today, at least it seems to me at any rate, has lost a sense of the humanist project. Humanist in this sense of trying to articulate a conception of the human that is a conception of a shared common identity and such like. I'll just make a final step, and it's this. Insofar as the Royal Institute of Philosophy sees part of its task as encouraging philosophers, professional philosophers, to engage with non-philosophical audiences, it might also consider the importance of having the non-philosophers play some influence, have some influence in shaping the work of philosophers. Now, how might that come about? Well, it seems to be by having conversations about, if I can put it this way, the human condition, what it is to be human, what the human world is, what the boundaries of the human world are, what the implications of thinking of ourselves as existing in a kind of shared common structure. And I would say I prefer to think of that project for the future than one that is developing. I don't say it's developing within the Royal Institute, but it's a growing feature within academic life, which I have to say I deprecate, and that's activism. It seems to me there is currently ongoing an abuse of philosophical position where it's being deployed in the service of particular causes that individuals may favour or not. I want to say more about why I think that is an abuse, but basically at its heart is the idea that where philosophy touches life, whether in art, whether in some conception of transcendence, whether in politics and so on, what is reaching out to life is something that has, as it were, to move back towards the centre as well. So there's a kind of oscillation between the centre, and the centre, broadly speaking, metaphysical questions, and then there's a reach out, and then there's a pull back, and one thing and another. But I think that the activist tendency that I see in evidence now really is activism. It's an instance, by the way, of what in the United States is called advocacy scholarship, which is you use your academic position to try to lend prestige or force to your own commitments. And there have been some famous examples of this, which I won't recite now, but very controversial ones, including some quite prominent figures, and the extent to which they may even be misrepresenting things, but using their scholarship, as it were, as a kind of, using the prestige of their scholarship to make it seem that things are perhaps other than or more complex than they represent them as being. But I do think that there's a danger currently that philosophy sees or some philosophers anyway, see their role as not really being reflecting on the human condition, but getting out there and modifying it or kicking it about or whatever it is they may want to do. And that seems to me is something that both, as it were, the realists of the early part of the 20th century and the idealists of the 19th century would both deprecate as being unfaithful to the reflective spirit of philosophy, which should induce, and indeed did in many of these figures, a kind of humility, a recognition of the complexity of life, the plurality of values and so on, and that would make one hesitant, as it were, about deploying one's philosophical credentials in advocacy of particular pet projects that one feels committed to. Anyway, on that point I shall stop. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, John. That was a very rich talk. Many questions I could ask you, but I promise it would be no more than 3. So let me start with a sort of historical one, which is, you talked about Moore and Russell rejecting idealism. I don't know this history, but I'm just trying to think back to which early works of Moore and Russell I can remember. Did they reject it because they thought they'd refuted it, or did they reject it because they just began over again somewhere quite else?
They thought that it rested on bad arguments. And I mean, there is Moore's famous essay, The Refutation of Idealism, and Russell contributes in different ways. I think they thought that this was just sloppy thinking, and that people, as it were, had puffed themselves up with an idea about reality and their particular access to reality, because these are the philosophers who are delivering this message. And had done so on the basis of rather poor argumentation. It is relevant to mention, of course, here that something happened in the 19th century, the later part of the 19th century, that Russell did not originate, but very quickly appropriated, which was he contributed it also, but it was the development of mathematical logic and a level of rigor. There's an article, the figure for those who already know, but perhaps those who don't, is Gottlieb Frege, a German mathematician, but who also ventured into the understanding of language and wrote some correspondence in which he said he hoped that these sort of methods might be extended to the consideration of philosophical questions. Now, he did indeed introduce great precision, and not just precision, but creativity. I mean, he introduced ways of thinking about how you represent ordinary language constructions in ways that were perspicuous. In fact, the phrase, the perspicuous representation, is in fact Frege's expression. And Russell picked this up, and Moore to a degree, but more Russell, and thought, look, I mean, let's just look at the logical structure of these people's arguments, and they're hopeless. That's what they thought. In particular, the fallacious inference from modes of description to modes of reality. So I can describe something. I mean, supposing I describe, myself, well, the right and left aren't particularly helpful here, but that is as elevated in some respect with regard to the floor. Okay, I stand in that relation to the floor. Well, that indeed is, you can give a description of me in which the term the floor appears, right? But that doesn't mean there's this object, which is the Haldane floor relation, right? This relational being. And it was that sort of means of constructing or inference that it seemed to Russell, at any rate, underlay idealism. That they had constructed this picture of a unity, an absolute, somebody used the term the absolute and so on the basis of a very bad argument. Now, I don't think that Russell himself was that invested, actually, in the metaphysics of any of this. And Russell himself, of course, in his epistemology, slides back into a kind of phenomenalism in which all we're ever acquainted with are our own subjective states and so on. So in that respect, that's a different kind of idealism, but in that respect, he isn't free. So I'm not sure how much these figures were. I mean, I think, last remark, I think in the case of G. Moore, G. Moore was a great advocate of common sense. And I think he thought, oh, what's all this stuff? Look, let's just deal with what we know. And what we know is, and we just have a little list of things that we know. But yes, I think it was more that they were irritated by what they saw as an overinflated and very influential move. And then they thought, and also, I did say a final remark, here's a final remark, and this is what I was trying to bring out. There was a sense in England in this period that actually philosophy was quite fresh in England as a profession. I mean, the first people appointed to positions in philosophy in England were in the 19th century, towards the end of the 19th century. And that they wanted to but they knew there was this massive movement, this idealist movement, strongly represented in the Scottish universities and so on. And so I think they wanted to kind of get philosophy going in England. And so having a new philosophy or a new platform or a new program also probably would have served that purpose. This is, by the way, why I'm very interested in the way in which different social forces actually feed into the content of philosophical ideas.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. I think I'm just going to ask you one more, because
I'll make my
you guys
briefer,
need an opportunity to ask questions. And it's this, which is, you talked in the course of your history about the foundation of the ethical societies, which had their origins in nonconformist Christianity. Do you think that the more abstract end of philosophy, metaphysics and epistemology, is as closely related to the permanent interests of the human spirit as ethics?
I do, actually, yes. I mean, I think that this aspect of the human spirit, as it were, it's a desire to understand what we are. What am I, as it were? I mean, not in the way that that's going to be answered by a physiologist or an anatomist or a biologist or whatever it is. And this, again, relates to the question of ideas. And when we ask the question, what are we mean things like, what are we as personal beings, right? Things that have values, things that stand in moral and ethical and emotive and sexual relationships to other people and all of that stuff. It was personal being that we're concerned with. But that question is, as it were, a metaphysical question. I mean, it may be part of the answer is that we're moral beings, and it may be that we're aesthetic beings, and it may be, and so on and such like. But it is fundamentally a metaphysical question. And I think people do feel that there's this question hanging there that requires an answer. Now, one interesting aspect of when philosophers sort of evacuated that territory was the rise of two things. And when they evacuated metaphysics, I know there's been a return, but when they evacuated, the rise of two things, and you can see the strength of this very much. One was natural science in its application to the living world, as it were, natural history, as it were, and that becomes very popular. But also things like astronomy and this sort of thing. And what's the nature of reality? Well, just ask the astronomers or us, and they're probably on television, and they've got very engaging presentations. And the other one is on the sort of the other side of things, the normative, existential, if you like, side of things, is the rise of biography. The enormous interest in history and biography. And I think the interest is there, you know, the humanistic, that the interest is there, but it wasn't being, and to some extent still isn't being served by philosophers. But you can see that it's there, the appetite, because people are coming forward, perhaps unwittingly, to serve it. And biography and history are part of the one side of it, and natural history and astronomy are part of the other side of it. So these are the two elements of the address that the human spirit is interested in. What's the nature of reality? What's our place within it? And how ought we to live?
How succinctly you phrase those questions. Right. I suspect the answers would be not quite so succinct.
No, indeed.
Over to you. Questions, please. There is a microphone somewhere. Yes, over on by the wall. Halfway back.
They don't need to be questions. They can be observations or criticism. I'm perfectly happy with any of those. Yeah.
I feel like I should stand up and pull my jacket and sort of have my Icelandic bag full of frozen food now. I know nothing about philosophy. I'm coming from an environmental background, sort of environmental engineer, sort of trying to make development sort of greener, etc. But I sort of wonder, on your point about idealism versus realism, in the kind of world that I work, you know, we get very stuck in the sort of silo specialism versus holistic sort of approaches. And I wonder whether, and that's kind of moved on a lot, of whether that's related to more directly to what's going on, to what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Whether there is a sort of...
Well, in one way it is. I mean, let's start out with the way that it isn't necessarily, and then I'll say the way in which it is. The way in which it isn't necessarily, I mean, what you're talking about are certain views within environmental science about whether you treat things discretely, or whether you treat them in groups, or whether you treat them in relation to their environment, you know, and to scale it up and such like. And there are some people who would want to say, look, you can't think of these things apart from the other things with which they're interacting proximately and remotely, and the general conditions under which all of these things are behaving and such like. That seems to me as partly a sort of methodological I mean, it's not that anybody denies that these relations exist between, you know, what might be closely present things and distant things and so on. But the question is to what extent it's profitable or illuminating to focus in independently or to sort of zoom out. That seems to me partly a question for empirical science, but and the conduct of that science and its application. But the connection with philosophy and what I was talking about, idealism, I think is through the notion of holism here. That's to say, what the idealist is saying is that if you want to understand human beings in the sense in which that question arose, what am I and such like, that's not a question about me as an individual. It's a question about humanity. And humanity here doesn't just mean, as it were, the total number of people in the world, as it were. It's about something that is extended historically in time, culturally in different ways and so on. But it's that inquiry can't be usefully or all adequately pursued by just looking at a given individual or even a population at a given time. We have to, as it were, to try to search for what are the concepts. I mean, the American philosopher Paul Churchland, a eliminative materialist famously, who's a great critic of folk psychology, he says things like this. I mean, why are we bothering, the current state of folk psychology, everyday common sense psychology, is absolutely primitive. We've got no advance from what we had with the classical Greeks. And, now we need to get rid of all that stuff and replace it with a scientific psychology. But this is crazy. I mean, it's as if you were to say in literature that the latest is necessarily the best. Now, astrophysics, that might be true, right? You're not going to read historical journals unless for some antiquarian interest, because science is cumulative. But nobody thinks that literature or art, which is the aspect of the cult, which is then nourished by and informs this folk psychology, is progressive in that sort of way. We can learn from reading the ancients, because the ancients and us, in our attempt to answer that question, are engaged in the same inquiry. So it's an inquiry that extends holistically over time, but also across cultures. It's an effort to understand what is the essence of the human. And in understanding that, recognizing it as something in which we participate collectively. And I think this also helps with certain if you look at the state of the dysfunctionality of institutions now in terms of the antagonisms between forces and such like. Sorry, but I hope that's relevant.
So there's at the front first, and then I'll go to you towards the back.
Hello there.
Hi, thank you so much for your speech. It was very interesting. I'm curious about the future of philosophy and sort of reshaping the paradigm and perhaps creating a synthesis from antithesis and thesis. And for example, logical positivists, they, I'm sure, were influenced by modern science and neuroscience and origin of species. So there is this there's this wave of ground everything in reason and empirical data and observations. And idealists seems like they are up against something that it's hard to stop in terms of development and the question of free will and thinking how can we strive for better morals and be more prescriptive. So what would you say is the near future of philosophy and how to reconcile the two if we can?
Well, thank you. I mean, I think that something I didn't have time to develop, but I'll just mention in passing that's related to this is, if you think about the relationship of philosophy to other things, let's say to economics, to the arts, to science, to religion, whatever element of human activity you're concerned with, and each and all of them. When philosophers think about that, I think they tend to think in a somewhat limited and shallower way, where they're thinking about the impact or the influence of these things on their activity. But I think a more profound way of thinking about it is the relationship between the subject matter of those different other spheres and their influence and proper influence within philosophy. That's to say, within the way in which philosophers think. Now, Marx, for example, there's this remark of Hegel's. I'm much more sympathetic to Hegel than I am to Marx. So Hegel says, when philosophy paints its grey and grey, then has the form of life grown old. By means of philosophy, it cannot be rejuvenated, it can only be understood. When philosophy paints its grey and grey, form of life has grown old. By means of philosophy, it can only be understood, it cannot be rejuvenated, it cannot be reanimated. Hegel's thought there is that philosophy can be very insightful in understanding forms of human life, but its task is not, as it were, to transform those. They will be transformed immanently or internally by the dynamic within the forms of life themselves. Marx, with those remarks in mind, in his sentences on Feuerbach, says, philosophers only sought to understand the world, the task is to change it. Now, there's sort of debate among Marxist scholars as to whether, when Marx said that, what he meant was, we need a new kind of philosophy, which is one that changes the world, doesn't really understand it, or whether what Marx meant was we need something other than philosophy. Now, I think that Marx thought this latter. I think that Marx thought, no, there is philosophy, and that's what Hegel was doing, but philosophy is simply, all it can do is to enable us to understand something. It can't enable us, as it were, to get into the thing and make it happen. Now, this is connected with my concluding remarks about activism. I think that the activist is often under the guise of being a philosopher doing something other than philosophy. They're actually using their position to lend prestige and seeming theoretical underpinning for their own enthusiasms. And I think that's not good for philosophy. And now what's going to happen? Well, here I am a bit of a Marxist in these matters. I do think the economic forces that are operating on philosophy are very significant. And I think that, you see, the Royal Institute of Philosophy in its efforts, very proper efforts, to engage with the public and one thing and another, and to do, engage in certain activities that constitute a kind of outreach, as it were, of academic philosophy, is at risk of becoming an instrument, not just any other sort of funder of certain kind of activities, of the need of academic philosophers to meet impact requirements. So in the University of St Andrews, in the last couple of weeks, maybe it was even this week, I can't remember, an email came round, which was coming from the research office or whatever it was, and it was saying that in your proposals for your own, if you're outlining your own research or looking for any support for your research or wanting your time off and so on, you have to describe in the project proposal, as it were, what the impact component is going to be. Now, there's all sorts of reasons, because of the nature of the funding, 25%. It is 25%, isn't it?
Something like that.
Yeah, 25% of the funding is given for the impact element. Now, what are philosophers doing under those circumstances? Well, what would anybody do under certain kind of economic pressures? They're going to start to producing impact. But of course, what that means is they're wanting opportunities to be able to say, oh, I addressed an audience of non-philosophers and such like, and they were handed out pieces of paper and they respond and say, that was very interesting. I learned a lot from that, or whatever else.
Which we're not going to do.
No, which you're not going to do, yeah. Now, I don't think that the Royal Institute is tempted in that direction. But there's a lot of pressure coming from within academic philosophy to find opportunities to tick that box, because ticking that box is required for getting the money that you want. Anyway, what I think is going to happen is that, I actually think what's going to happen is philosophy is going to shrink in Britain. There's going to be less of it. A lot of it's not going to be very good. And that I think at some point there's going to be a sort of internal counter-revolution. And people are just going to say, this just isn't good enough. We've got to do better. And doing better really, I think it's going to parallel what's happened with the expansion of universities. Look, the current situation is that we've got all these departments of whatever subjects are around the country. Students are fighting one another to get into the best institutions because they want the best. They want to be credentialed by the best institutions, but they're fighting to get into the best institutions. And we're going into a situation now with a sort of crisis in the universities, and we will see the loss of some universities, and indeed we ought to see the loss of some universities in my own view. But I think within philosophy we'll see something similar. I think the expansion has been overblown. I think it's induced certain kind of spurious activities of a second-rate kind and so on. And I think we'll see a purging of that, partly because I think people who know better and can do better will just say this doesn't bring any real reward to us.
Well, at that point I'm going to bring in another question,
Yes.
which is towards the back on this side of the room.
That was an entirely unprovocative response, you'll understand. Yeah. I'm keeping my provocation for later. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was delightful to hear you talk. And if I understand it, there were two connections that you made, at which, if I understand them, I don't really understand them. So I was
have a shot.
I was wondering if you'd be kind enough to elaborate on them. So one was the rejection of idealism led to a focus on more descriptive rather than normative philosophy.
Yes.
And the other was that there's a relation between idealism and humanism.
Yes.
With the implication being realists are perhaps not humanists. And so I was wondering if you could maybe sort of elaborate a little bit on those connections and perhaps...
Well, remind me again what the first connection was.
Oh, sorry. So the earlier rejection of idealism leading to a focus on
Oh yes,
descriptive.
yes. Go on.
Rather
Did
than
you want me to say
normative.
something about that first,
So
or
a little bit about both the descriptive
Yes.
bit and the
Yes.
humanism.
Well, I mean, I sort of gave some examples of this, but in moral and political philosophy, it brought about a view that the task of the philosopher is really that of the taxonomer as well. I mean, they study this as a phenomenon. They've not as well to try to contribute to it. They've just got to study it, as one was. And this is very odd if you think about moral philosophy or political philosophy, right? That no, it's not the task of political philosophy to come up with accounts of justice. I mean, this was transformed in 1971 by John Rawls as a theory of justice, but of course that came from America, right? And Isaiah Berlin, just a few years before that, I mean, maybe 2 or 3 years before that, had written an introduction to a collection of essays on political philosophy in which he famously said, it's a little puzzling as why there should be this collection, because political philosophy is moribund, it's dead, it's over. Or at least for the time being. I don't know if it's dead for the time being, but anyway. Well, why was it moribund? Well, it was because for political philosophers, or philosophers who engaged in reflection on political theory and so on, saw their task as simply a descriptive one, trying to say what the relations are between certain concepts of rights or whatever else it may be, whatever the domain was, whatever the particular concepts were. And as I said, that's why Oakeshott and the LSE school, Shirley Robin Letwin and Kenneth Minogue and so on, were concerned with the kind of political theory that abhorred the idea of normative political philosophy. That really wasn't at all the task, and that was now, this became quite, but you could find it everywhere, the task of, in epistemology, in the theory of knowledge, for example, people say, well, look, our task is to analyze the concept of knowledge, right? It's not just to talk about what's good knowledge, what's bad knowledge, what kind of knowledge is worth having, or whatever else it may be. It's just to understand what knowledge is. That was slightly punctured by Quine when he gave an account or suggested an account of the task of epistemology as not really to try to justify our claim, to show that we have knowledge, but to take it that we do have knowledge, which seems pretty obvious, and then to understand what the mechanisms are by which knowledge is acquired and then distributed and so on. So he was interested in something that really, in a way, did touch on the mechanics. But what he wasn't interested in was the question of good knowledge or bad knowledge, or he just thought, insofar as philosophy has any standing, it's because it's the abstract end of science. As he put it, philosophy of science is all the philosophy there is. Well, that's obviously, I don't agree with that. So in these different spheres, you can see philosophers sort of just withdrawing from evaluation, as it were.
Do you want to say a little bit about the
yes,
humanism?
and then I was just going to say, but here's the connection. It's not, as it were, that the realist, if the realist is somebody who thinks that, as well, the issues under discussion concern some, or in privileged cases, concern mind-independent reality. It's not that prevents the realist from being a humanist, but it's just that, as it were, the idealist is just immediately there, because their conception of the world, and as I say, there are a lot of different kinds of ideas, their conception of the world is that the world is the human world. Right? So it's not as if you're investigating something that is over and against us. These investigations are, in a sense, investigations of ourselves. And not psychological investigations of ourselves, they're not empirical investigations of ourselves. They're an attempt to try to articulate the structures of human meaning and value. And of course, that can then be corrective or recommendatory. You could say, well, look, we've gone off track here. We've been snared by a trap of some kind or another, and so we need to recover. I should say, this wasn't in any way what prompts my interest about humanism, which I've been writing about recently. But I have to say, last week, I think it was, I was in the area between Rome and Florence, going via going Orvieto and a number of Arezzo and places like that, up through Siena to Florence for a week. You go into these small Italian hill towns with a population of about 20,000. You go into a church that's 1,000 years old, and you look at works that are of immense art historical importance. I took my daughter to see a very famous work by Masaccio, and you're thinking, this world articulated a conception of the human that then found expression in philosophy, in the Florentine Academy, supported by the Medici and so on, the Neoplatonic Academy, but it found it in literature, it found it all, I mean, just art, everything, you know, the quality of the humanism. And then as it were, you turn around and look back at, you know, our world and think, what sort of contribution is this making to civilization? I mean, what contribution is philosophy making to civilization? Now, I know I put this in a form of a provocation, but nonetheless, that's the kind of thing I have in mind. So it's not that as well the realist is barred from being concerned about the human condition, but as it were, it's another topic they might want to engage with. Whereas the idealist is immersed, their subject matter is, in a broad sense, the human in its epistemological, metaphysical, ethical, aesthetic, and so on dimensions.
Now, we've started a tiny bit late. I'm going to violate my usual principle by saying if there is one more question, as long as it's a quickie, if you would like to ask it. Is there one?
If the question is it true, the answer is yes.
Okay, right at the back, please. Yeah. And if you could keep the
answer
on the brief side.
Yeah, I know. I'm a philosopher. I can't stop talking.
Thanks. So it might actually go very well from your previous answer. But I was interested when you mentioned Emerson's transcendentalism. It made me think of the next American to come and give the Gifford lectures, or one of the next, William James, which led to the varieties of religious experience.
Exactly, yeah.
And I just sort of wondered whether, you know, and that work is sort of more about the mystical kind of tradition, which sort of links to transcendentalism. And I wondered whether idealism, you think, sort of leads to to that sort of direction, and whether, similar to what you've just said about the purpose of philosophy, I think in sort of general climate, the young people, one of the things I noticed was that young people are increasingly identifying as spiritual without a specific religious affiliation, sort of links to that sense. And so we could talk about the Neoplatonic sense as well, and everything is one, which you just mentioned. But do you think there's a lot of opportunity there for further inquiry, and it's relevant and sort of relevant?
I'll have to give a word. Well, very briefly, just to begin with an anecdote, William James was invited to give the Gifford lectures, and he had a nervous breakdown, and and his sister was very concerned about, you know, his state of health and so on. So she was saying, "Oh, you can't go all the way to Scotland and do that," and so on. So he recommended his colleague Josiah Royce, who actually gave the ones that James would have done, and James's sister was absolutely outraged. She said he'll go over there with the absolute in his hands, and, you know, all the rest of it, such like. And then James recovered, and then gave the varieties of religious experience. I think the question of the transcendent is very interesting. I mean, the late Roger Scruton, whom I knew very well for many years, he and I had an intermittent sort of debate about this. So Scruton came increasingly to think that, as it were, we couldn't have a conception of the world, I mean, the human world, that didn't have a sort of spiritual transcendent component in it, right? But he had a sort of, well, I'll just put it this way, reductive explanation for that. What he thought was that human sensibility and subjectivity, as it were, overflows. It's so powerful in us. We can't contain it, as it were, as merely as a feature of this body, as it were. We have to see, you know, it outflows, and, as it were, spills off into the world, as it were. And we then read it back. So we see the world as if it has as if there's a subject in the world, that we're engaging interpersonally with some aspect. You know, looking at a landscape, for example, has a kind of meaning for us. It seems imbued with meaning. Now, Scruton's view at the end of the day was that actually what's happening here, as it were, is that we are meaning-generating animals. And, as it were, we produce so much of the stuff that we simply can't contain it within ourselves, but, as it were, we project it out into the world. It's like the Humean picture of this. And then, of course, we seem to see it as there, and then we make this mistake, as it were, of objectifying it. But he didn't think we could stop doing that, and so he did think that part of understanding the human condition was to have a sort of transcendental orientation, an orientation, one might even say, towards the divine. He talked about the world as the face of God and things of that sort. But I think but his view is, well, that was almost an anthropological remark. It's something about us. I do think the question of the transcendent opens up here, because I do think that, as it were, the question, well, I just have to stop now, right? The question is, are we talking about social constructivism when I talk about the human world? Are we talking about something more than that? And then I think that does raise the question as to whether or not the seeming personality or personhood of the world is itself a manifestation of objective mind. And this then leads you towards kind of objective idealism, and then as well the ground of that objective idealism. And that would take you in the direction of divinity.
Plenty more to
Yeah,
talk about.
of course.
But we must draw it to a close there, John. Thank you so much.
Not at all. Thank you very much.